I'm MP Carver, and I'm here speaking with Stephen Cramer. We're going to talk about his forthcoming book from Arrowsmith Press, Departures from Rilke, along with some of his other work. Stephen, the first thing I'd love to know, could you just tell us a little bit about this project and how it came into being?
And in fact, the book is available now. It's not even just for pre-order, it's actually for order. This grew out of, well, I'll start by saying I've always read Rilke and have loved Rilke. I have read him in translation unless I would sit down with a German English dictionary and puzzle him out in the original, which I did many years ago and translated a few of his early poems, but knew that I did not read idiomatic German well enough, or did not read it idiomatically enough to really get what you get when you read a poem and you know the language. It was really just a kind of an individual writing prompt I was rereading mainly the translations of new poems, which were his first really great poems, 2 volumes of lyrics, the ones translated by Edward Snow. And it feels a little arrogant to say so, or sounds a little arrogant to say so. I would read them and say, there is something in here of Rilke, I'm sure, but it's not satisfying as poetry in English. It's dutiful, but there are lots of aspects to it that in an English poem, I'm pretty sure most experienced readers of English poetry would say that's a bit too many adjectives. That's awfully highfalutin, even for poems written in the early 20th century. So I took a very familiar one, The Panther, and I said, what would happen if you took one line out of each stanza, not deleted the line, but deleted a line's worth of words, and tried to emphasize active verbs and concrete details rather than adjectival or adverbial definers, of which there are many. And again, in German, it might be fully textured language. I don't read German idiomatically enough to know. And it happened really quickly. And I really liked the result. I didn't think of myself doing, then I did another. It was like potato chips, do another. I did not think of this as a project until maybe 6 or 7 satisfying experiences in doing this. And then I just said, keep going, which is often the case with me when I am working on something that has the promise to turn into a larger utterance. I said, Cramer, just keep doing it. See what happens. Don't worry about how far it goes. I do one a day. I would pick them based on just, I did many fewer than the total, like 170 something new poems. There were only 57. And I just found the ones that I thought, there's something in here I want to explore. And I had two restrictions. One is remove a line's worth of wordage from every stanza. And second, nouns and verbs whenever possible. And then one liberation, which was if the poem you're working on departs from Rilke's premises almost altogether, follow it. So a good number of these poems really, that's why it's departures. I would not, if somebody said, can you give me a translation of Rilke? I would not recommend this book.
Right. And actually, can I ask you on that word departures? I know it connects to your teacher, Donald Justice. Did you know right away that you were going to call these departures?
No, I didn't, because I felt you can't steal that from Don. Because I think one of his best books, although all his books are great, was called Departures, and it was departures in every sense of the word. It he he was a poet for whom other texts, were inspirations. And in fact, he's one of the great poets of reading as a subject. Not necessarily explicitly, but just because he would do that. So he has variations on a text by Vallejo. He had variations on Raphael Alberti, French poets. So there was a point where I realized this is kind of an homage to him. But there are many people who have done this, contemporary and way back. Don Patterson, The Eyes, which is a book I really loved. And there was a point where I was going, you kind of got a partner in this with Don Patterson's versions of Mikado called The Eyes. And then Daisy Freed did a book of Baudelaire versions, and hers are great because she ends by saying, I don't like Baudelaire. So anyway, it just kept going, and they did get more and more unfaithful to Rilke. And that, if they hadn't, I think I would have lost interest.
Okay. And in what way would you say they became less faithful? Do you think that you were becoming more confident putting your own experience in, or were you just, as you were engaging more deeply, just seeing other connections to be made? Or
mostly the latter, and I can give some examples of that. There's a very well-known poem where that's based on a picture of his father in a military uniform, late 19th century uniform. And I had been wanting to write about this picture of my uncle, who was my father's twin brother, who died at Anzio, so I never met him. And that Rilke's shell allowed me to fill it with a very different set of contents. Although anyone who reads it would say, if they know the Rilke poem, they would know that. Some of them argue with Rilke. There's a poem that he called Leda, that, like many Leda and the Swan poems, airbrushes the sexual assault, and I didn't want to do that. It's actually a poem that some people who have read the manuscript have liked among the best and said, you could get in trouble for this. Just because it doesn't it doesn't pull its punches on what's going on. But I think that's what's the problem with Leda and the Swan and Rilke's Leda. Others are very compressed, recognizable versions of the originals. If I wanted a completely different ending and it came to me, I wrote the completely different ending or beginning, or there are tons of images in these poems that might be recognizable generally that are not Rilke's.
Right. And actually, I want to quickly go back to Leda and the Swan. So you mentioned that people were saying to you that you might get in trouble for this, or it might be sensitive. Did you ever consider changing it, or not including it, or did you know that this was what you wanted to say and it belonged in the collection?
I never considered not including it in the collection. I was surprised by, and both satisfied and glad for, the way it questions the tradition that treats a sexual assault, a mythological depiction of a sexual assault, as somehow ethically neutral. So none of that. There were some people have read it, friends of mine who have liked the poem and said, it still makes me feel it has a triggering effect on me. that is a very complicated issue. Uh, for that reason, I doubt I would read it out loud.
Right.
Because I don't know everyone in the audience, and I would not want to publicly create anything that would upset people in that. I mean, this book is really, a lot of it is very dark.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, there's a lot of dismemberment and rotting flesh and whatever. But this particular poem could be a particular kind of catalyst. But the book hasn't gotten, it's gotten one review, really, I guess two reviews. I have no idea if anyone's going to say this man should have kept his hands off that subject. I guess we'll find out if anybody notices enough to object. My response will be that the poem itself has to stand or fall on its effect, not my intentions.
Right. And would you read a few of the poems from it for
Yeah,
us?
not that one.
Yeah, no, I understand completely. So I worry about that a lot. With my students, some of the things that are worth studying in class, are things that are upsetting. And so you always have to make that decision about, how to approach the material. Part of the point of these things is that something like that should be upsetting.
Exactly.
Right. And, the role of literature is to address that. But of course, when people are confronted with it in the moment, it can be so difficult, especially considering it's, sexual assault is is something so many people have experienced. And then to have that come back up in public, I think not reading it aloud and forcing that confrontation on people, letting them come to it in their own homes is probably the right choice.
It's a complication that for centuries nobody thought about.
Right, right.
Because the people who were in the position to have thoughts, it wouldn't have occurred to them to think of it. Right. I do feel more than ambivalent. I feel like the fluid border between ideas and emotions is vexed right now, and I'm not persuaded that the emotional response is always the valid focus of art. But it's a question that many people didn't ask for a long time. So it's good that it's being asked. I know I have colleagues who are very upset about it. Think that it's destroying the possibility for education to have the edge it needs to open the mind. And right. There are cases where I think they're right, and there are cases where I think they're wrong. Anyway, we are digressing.
On to lighter topics like death.
Right, no. like death. Was that the one you would like me to read?
Or I know that I know you had picked out a few. Why don't you read those three?
All right. I only remember two of the three. Actually, no, now I remember. This one I didn't mention, but I want to read it because I got an email from my sister. She got the book, and she said how much she liked this poem called Sisters. So I'll start with that. Do you need a page number? Or it's 63. And this is interesting in that the whole last stanza is not in Rilke at all. I don't think this needs any background gloss. Sisters. Notice how they each do the same thing differently, as if the years between them made separate spots of time in one room. Each holds the other, being held. If tired, one can't wear the other out, and neither needs to ask if the other one needs blood. On walks, they used to almost touch, taking steps that matched like a march. One died. What rhymed at one time off rhymes now. So, I mean, it should be obvious to anyone that my sister and I lost a sister. And we also lost a brother. Okay, this one grew out of a fairly well-known Rilke poem called "The Reader," and there's again that's in here, some of it, but much of it does leave the premises. Charlotte reading, 2005. This girl who lets herself sift down from her life into another's. Who is she? Sidetracked only in the instant a page turns. Even her father's not sure who sits there, her book steeped in her shadow. An hour or so, and who knows how much of her she's lost before she tires of mining her underground of books. Her eyes lift, taking in and giving back a whole world, the way the quietest child among children plays alone, then looks up with a shock from the finished puzzle. But her face, still at rest, keeps changing in some way. And then this one, I feel like bringing the computer up to show you the photograph because it's of Ethan looking at a globe. I don't know, he's about at most 1.5, probably a little less. And he's sort of looking at the globe. He has his hand on the globe, and he looks like it looks like something out of 2001. And again, this poem. God, I'm not sure I can remember which Rilke poem it's based on. I know every one of them is in some ways had a genesis with Rilke. So which was it? One called "The Baby"? I'd have to. You know what? I could look it up later because I have the Snow translations here, which are the main ones that I stole from or used to my purposes. Photograph of Ethan looking at a globe, 1999. We don't recall if he knew how to spin it. Afterwards, his profile might have turned to face us with his plump look of clarity, round as a watch, brief as an hour. Now, he barely has time to keep up with time. What was work, sex, the sleep both require. Do you, like me, sometimes stop to glimpse his fingers skimming across the North Atlantic, as though he had all the time in the world? Now, I will just say one thing. Mm-hmm. And whether this is true about this poem or not is not up to me, but Charles Simic once said, the dream of every cliche is to end up in a good poem. And I'd like to believe that the absolute deliberate use of the cliche in the last line, that he had all the time in the world, gets its reason for being from the context of the poem.
Right. Yeah. And will you talk more about that last line. And I also noticed at the end of Charlotte Reading and some of the other poems that struck me about this book, the last lines are very striking. And in a few cases, the most striking last lines were, I noticed, departures from
Yeah.
Rilke, but especially that last line in Charlotte Reading,
Mm-hmm.
or the last sentence rather, but her face still at rest keeps changing in some way. Um,
I forget.
and
It makes me want to look up what a straight. Do we have? We probably don't have time for that, do we? At one point I thought, should there be like an index that says that points to the German title? I mean, I use German originals. The whole thing is on the web, and I didn't even bring it up with Askold. And I just thought, man, if somebody really wants to do that, they can do that. Because I really, and I had a lot of talk with friends about, should the afterword be an afterword or an introduction? I definitely wanted to write about the book, something I've never done before. And I decided on the afterword because I figured let the poems stand on their own before any intervention on the part of the author.
Right. A couple times when reading it, I did go back to try to find the originals, and the thing that really helped me was that they were in order with the new poems, even though
Right.
some were skipped. So that really helped me find my way through.
Right. Which is
Yeah,
something
but
maybe worth mentioning, that there was a point where I said the order of this book is going to be the order of the poems in the Rilke volumes, with let the gaps for it fall there where they may. You will not impose any other kind of order. And it was, I don't know whether unconsciously, the clutch of poems about family at the end, because I don't think they're all about family in Rilke. So there was a way in which improvisation became order,
right.
which I really was one of the exciting things about doing it. And I'm sure if you're a poet, you know that the most exciting thing is what happens to you when you write.
Oh, you mean in the experience or in what you discover?
What you
Or both,
discover.
maybe. Okay.
Well, one could say both, but I mean mainly in the process of writing. It's whether however you talk about it, the zone or the unconscious or whatever, that's finally to a large degree why we do it, I think. I mean, I don't think we do it to impose our ideas, because we have no more ideas than normal people.
I tell my students sometimes, if we had any answers, we wouldn't need poetry.
Right, exactly.
But yeah, I know what you mean, that moment when you're writing and you can barely even see,
Right.
like the
You're
mind is.
you're trying to get something right by a standard you don't understand entirely. I
Mhm.
mean, I like uh, um, mechanical metaphors. I mean, I like the idea of like trying to get the joints to fit. So maybe all you end up is with a table, and sometimes you end up with a fountain.
Well, this will actually this will take us a little bit briefly away from Rilke, but I was listening to a reading, and at the start of it you said you used the phrase that goofy is underrated in poetry. It just when I think about the mechanical metaphor and kind of how fun that can be depending on how it's done. Can you say a little bit more about that?
Yeah. Some of my absolute favorite modern American poets are really funny, and
Mhm.
not just witty, ironic. I mean, Louise Glick can be really funny, but she's not knee-slappingly funny. Maybe in that book about divorce, she is. Frank O'Hara could be knee-slappingly funny. Tony Hoagland could be knee-slappingly funny. Mary Ruefle can be knee-slappingly funny. What is that one? I'm going to misquote it. I woke up this morning avid for this day, but you know how those things go. And I'm misquoting the first line, unfortunately. So there's an entertainment value to that, but there's also access to a certain part of human emotional experience that I don't think you get any other way, because that's how you sidle up to some of the more disturbing uh, thoughts that we have, that we sometimes don't want to acknowledge. Frank O'Hara, a woman asks us for money for a terrible disease. We don't give her any. We don't like terrible diseases. Now you're not supposed to laugh at that, but you can't help it, and
Right.
that's part of the point of humor, anyway. So that's what I mean by goofy.
Right. Oh, wonderful. Yeah, and I also notice in especially reading some of your other work, um, how delightfully you play with like language and twist the line and the syntax around. I was reading the start of dialogue for the left and right hand, and you had just
Oh,
the most beautiful stanza. I'm just going to read it so everybody can hear it. You misspeak me and turn shy, a child who runs to a parent and hugs a stranger's knees. Once placid, I'm active. Once a paper cup, once a trickle of water, now I'm thirst. But first I'm yearning, then yearning's aftermath. You never see the amaryllis lean toward the light. Just in
mhm.
that one stanza, there's just so much, so many interesting reversals and moments of language. I'm really
That's the
enjoying
poem,
it. I haven't
the
finished
ghost
it
and
yet.
the ghost in the wedding photograph.
Yes, yes, indeed. Yeah, yeah.
I
Um,
changed when I read it now, which is rarely. I changed aftermath to aftertaste.
oh, interesting. And do you often make small changes to poems even after they've been published?
I wouldn't say often, but I always do. In fact, I've made a few pencil corrections, or not corrections, but pencil edits in the Rilke book already. But they're in very light pencil because I'm not sure I mean them yet. But that one I just, it was published in, obviously, in the book, but also in the magazine. It was published in his aftermath, and it was at one point said, no, you want you want the taste buds involved. Aftermath is very abstract compared to aftertaste.
Right, right, right. And coming back to Rilke, so Rilke was a poet that, of course, I'd heard of, but I've never done any deep study of before getting ready for this interview. And even then, you couldn't call it deep. But one thing I'd love to know is I think he isn't studied as much in contemporary programs. What do you think that poets should be coming to Rilke for? Um,
Oh, okay. Well, first of all, I mean, when I was in a graduate program in University of Iowa in the mid 70s, I had read some Rilke before, but it was the most Rilkean of contemporary poets at that time, John Anderson, a wonderful poet that not enough people read anymore, who read Rilke to us in his favorite translations and made us all hear a certain kind of, I don't know how best to talk about it, a certain kind of minor key tone, because he read a lot of very early poems from the Book of Hours. When this sort of feels like going from the sublime to the ridiculous to copyright, but when Rilke's originals went into the public domain, and I think it was like in the late 90s or something, just like, a tsunami of translations started coming out. And, it was hard. I have not kept up with all of them, but I've certainly read a lot of them. So if Rilke, as a European modernist, sort of on the cusp of 19th century and 20th century sensibility, I think of him as sort of analogous to Yeats in that way. He modernized himself as he wrote. He didn't live as long as Yeats, uh, It's interesting to think that people aren't reading him as much anymore. I don't know, actually, in grad school, I don't really know who people are reading these days in terms of the work written in the previous century. And by previous century, one means the 20th, not the 19th century.
Right.
But Rilke was very important to most young, aspiring, most poets learning their craft in the 70s and 80s. People who want to read, straight translations of Rilke, I would recommend a book called The Unknown Rilke translated by Franz Wright. But even those take enormous liberties. I know that Askold mentioned he really likes those old Leishman translations, which are very awkward, I think. But so I don't know. I'm sort of off your question. Rilke, I did not expect when I started doing this. I did sort of say, "What, Rilke again?" And I just kept the faith with the notion that what I was doing was going to be interesting enough to me to keep doing. Because Rilke is in some ways the premise, but not the result of what's on the page.
Right, right. And would you say that before you started on this project, would you have called Rilke a major literary influence for you? I mean,
in a way, yes, but I have to say, not stylistically, because
okay.
I don't read German well enough to be influenced by him stylistically.
Mm-hmm.
But there were certain poets like John Anderson, like I would include Steve Orlin. There were poets who found in Rilke a way to express a kind of deep introspection in poetry that wasn't confessional, but was very intimate, that you really felt that when you read John Anderson's best poems, you feel like you are in conversation with them.
Mm-hmm.
And that's definitely something he derived from probably more Rilke's earlier poems than the new poems, and certainly more than Rilke's most famous poems are the Dueno elegies, which are these big, visionary meditations, much more. I think in German they're free verse. I don't think they're pentameter, but many have translated them into English pentameter. And then his sonnets to Orpheus, which are his last major sequence of poems, which, many of the new poems are sonnets, but none of them in Departures from Rilke. They can't be sonnets because if they're 14 lines in the original, they have to lose at least 2 or 3 lines. I cheated on that. So they are none of they're shaved sonnets, I guess, in what I've done. But he definitely is a major European modernist. But of course, he died before, he died in 26, so he had experienced the First World War. But unlike many of the European modernists who we read and love now, like Paul Celan or, Czesław Miłosz, the experience of the Second World War shapes or misshapes their poem. But Rilke is a weird, like Yeats again, because Yeats died in 1939. So there is, you sort of wonder, what would they have done? How would they have responded to that cataclysmic event on their doorstep?
Right, right.
Of course.
Um, and
Yeats
it
predicted it.
seemed, oh, sorry, what?
Yeats predicted it somewhat. The Second Coming is like he's seeing fascism, even though he himself flirted with authoritarian ideologies. Anyway,
Yeah, it seems impossible to figure out how to respond to some of the cataclysmic events going on right now, let alone to predict how somebody else would have approached them in the past. But
that's a very, if I may, I would, that leads to a comment about departures from Rilke that I feel uh, I'm glad I have a chance to make. Um, there are 4 or 5 poems in the book that could be construed as, I don't want to say responses to, that could be construed as including an awareness of the war in Ukraine
right.
or what war and does to human beings.
Mm-hmm.
I tried very hard not to force that. If the poem seemed to, like the poem that's called Bomb Site, which maybe I should read if there's time, is actually a poem. It's based on a poem called After the Fire, which has nothing about military conflict in it at all. It's about an actual fire that Seamus Heaney has translated quite beautifully. So for me, finding a way to acknowledge this global event going on as I was working on this weird kind of private project of craft was really important, in part because I struggle with how to acknowledge the social world in a way that doesn't feel like latte liberalism from someone who really hasn't had to. I do not have the family ancestry background that Askold has. You know, I mean, Askold's commitment to working against tyranny is bred in his bones.
Mm-hmm.
You know, I can't claim that. So, and you know, many Americans can't. Many white Americans can't. Uh, so, and you don't want to preach. You want the art to be interesting as art, but you also don't want to end up retreating to a certain kind of aesthetic insularity, you know, which, you know, I mean, John Ashbery, Louise Glick. I love Louise Glick's poem. She didn't have political bone in her body, and she couldn't have cared less.
Right.
And ultimately, I respect and I don't know if I admire it, but I respect it because that, you know, her large themes were fate, death, immortality. I mean, you know, what Emily Dickinson called the flood subjects, you know, but say any of her poems were feminist? Are you kidding? And I think some of them are implicitly. You know, I mean, I don't think she's a good number of her poems about relationships are very alert to the way men and women can and can't talk to each other, but she's pretty even-handed. You know, she doesn't take sides. She's against everything.
I think that's a fine position sometimes for the poet to take, right?
Well, I mean, it's a very interesting, you know, it's an issue that when I went to Iowa, nobody even brought it up. You
Right.
know, it didn't occur to people to think in terms of in what ways a poem could be important. You know, Miwash's lines what is poetry that does not save nations or people? You
Mhm.
know, we were down with the people, because you can participate in that on a personal level.
Mhm.
We never would have thought, and that has changed a lot, you know, to the good and to not so good
Right.
effects on the quality of the poetry.
Um,
Boy, are we getting off on
I know. Well, actually, I'm
that
gonna
okay?
actually. I'll have you read Bombsight, but before I do, are there any other? So the possibly the war in Ukraine. Are there are there other things about either the sort of what's going on in the world right now or what's going on in America that you are having trouble writing about or want to write about but are not sure how to address?
Um, well, I'll say this, I'm sort of not answering your questions, using your question um, to refer back to the book. There are at least two, one called Unhoused and one called Immigrant Family, that grow out of uh, two poems out of many that Rilke wrote that had to do with his experiences with the dispossessed in Paris.
Mm.
And his poems are pretty condescending, are
Right.
pretty objectifying. And without imposing it, I found a way to write about that dynamic, I hope, in a way that I believe, in a way that isn't condescending, but also isn't reductive or sentimentalizing. That uh, a, an unhoused person coming up to you creates a visceral reaction that's not always entirely embracing,
Mhm.
is something is a truth about human beings that I didn't want to shy from. So that's in there. Um, I'm trying to think if there are others that are like that. I can't remember right now. Um, but definitely Unhoused and Immigrant Family. Asylum, actually, as well. Asylum is called Lunatics.
Mhm.
What I hope happens in Asylum is that the lunatics change the world through their perceptions, just by looking out the window. Um, Subjects, I, I, I think I will never be a poet who writes consciously for uh, a population, a group of people whose life experience I want to give voice to, or add my voice to. How could I do that? I want to, I'm, to use Lowell's phrase, I'm a Mayflower screwball, and I can't help it.
Mhm.
I have written about my own, what I see as my own myopias. Uh, in Listen, there's a poem called God. How can I forget the title of this poem? Ours, which is about a racial confrontation that I think leaves both people bewildered. Um, there are, there's a poem called Dorado, which takes place in Puerto Rico, but I find myself, when I take on political subjects or any subjects involving social justice, the impulse that feels authentic to me, or not the impulse, the result that feels authentic to me, is a kind of owning up.
Mhm.
Not an abject confession. I am who I am, but I certainly don't feel like I can manufacture poetic outrage. I can be outraged and am outraged by the things that I see happening. But to claim that I have gut level solidarity would be a lie.
Right, right.
you know? And you can't lie in poetry, which doesn't mean you doesn't mean you can't invent.
You can't lie in good poetry.
Right. Oh yeah, there's a lot of preaching. Yeah.
Yeah.
And it's pretty much preaching to the converted. Ooh, we have 30 seconds left.
Yeah. Will you read a bomb site for us to close it out?
Yeah. Another one that I would add to that group of poems were the social worker. Well, they're the prisoner. There are two prisoner poems.
Mm-hmm.
I think they belong there, and also one called um, "The Town Square." Those matter to me a lot because they were utterly unbidden. I did not expect them yeah, a town square. I'd have to look at the Rilke version again, but I don't think it has the paranoia that came out. Now I can't find, where is it?
Oh, 56.
Thank you. I'll tell you a story someday about Alan Dugan giving a reading about page numbers. It's hilarious. Because people would make requests and say, only if you give me the page number. Have you read Alan Dugan?
Yes, years ago. Yeah, I can't remember. I think it's a selected.
Yeah, he was a great poet. Okay. Bomb site. Morning ignores it. And who knows? The burnt lime trees and pitted blocks of flats might be fakes. So might that warm crater filling with kids. God knows from where. Who play catch with the littlest one's shirt, then stop to watch a tenant's eldest son poke under the crushed, incinerated deck, teasing out twin tea kettles in a washtub. He looks like he's acting too. For the kids or anyone naive enough to think anyone lived here. Whatever remains is incredible as history now, where everyone's a stranger. For me, what was important about that poem was not just the setting, but also the irony about sort of turning it into fake news, sort of denying the existence that this, denying what you see right in front of your eyes. I think those poems speak or euphemizes something. I don't know about the purpose.
Yeah, and unfortunately, you mentioned that it came to you a little bit on the connection to what's going on with the invasion of Ukraine.
Yeah.
But of course, we can think about what's going on right now in Israel and Palestine, and unfortunately, it's something that we hope won't just keep going on, though it seems to.
Do you have time to? I just learned from a podcast. The person asked, "What is there any chance for?" And I'm trying to say this without at all taking sides.
Mm-hmm.
Is there any chance for a more progressive government in Israel in the near or distant future? And this guy is an expert historian on Israel, Benny. I don't remember his last name. He said no, and he said, but you might not guess why. Demographics. The hard right, fanatical right settlers in Israel have many more children than the liberal left Israeli citizens. So just by virtue of demographics, there will be more right-leaning voters. And, they will increase by a considerable proportion. So it's very unlikely that a government in Israel, I think I can say without controversy that Netanyahu is a disaster and still support Israel. Right. One of my favorite intellectuals, Yuval Harari, I don't know if you know, he wrote *Sapiens*.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
I mean, I just love him. He is a brilliant, wise historian, and on behalf of human flourishing, and believes in Israel's fundamental deserving to exist, and be the first one to say, if we have more Netanyahus, it's just going to be worse for everybody.
Have
We
you?
may edit this stuff out.
I know. We'll leave that to them to decide. Actually, I'll ask you. I know I've got to go, but I'm going to ask you. I'll ask you one more question so we can
Sure.
end on a more
Right.
cheerful note, a note that maybe we have some answers for. Right.
But wasn't that amazing? I would never have thought of that. That in fact the demographics are going to lean towards the religious right simply because they have 7 to 8 children, and most people have 2 to 3.
Right. Right. It's interesting to think about. Right. Yeah. Yeah.
And what are you going to do? Take away democracy? Limit the number of children people have?
Well,
All
yeah,
right.
other people
I'm
have
making
tried
things
that to
worse.
limited success, right? So,
Right.
but let me ask you this last question
Sure.
on a completely different note. But
Thank you.
so what advice would you give to a young poet starting out? I know everybody asks that, but I think it's always worth thinking about.
Well, yeah, I guess, I mean, the first thing I'd say is how young. Um,
Let's say college.
okay. Somebody in college, I would say read your eyeballs out and
Mm,
imitate the voice of anyone you admire, and read out loud with other people. Don't read, it's not homework. But if you don't love reading poetry, and that can be hard. There are times I hate reading poetry, but I love reading it, particularly with people.
mm,
Don't think that you have to do it alone, but it's not just, it is what feeds your love of the art you're going to practice,
mhm,
but it's also the way, it's the writer's form of reverse engineering.
mhm.
You know, I fell in love with Frank Conroy's sentences in a book of prose, and that probably affected my poetry writing as much as any book of poems. I just loved the plots of his cumulative sentences and the cinematics of it. If you don't love style, I don't think, there may be, maybe you should be writing journalism or something. But I mean, poetry is an event of language, or it's nothing.
Right, right. Yeah, and in tradition and communication, right, with all the poetry that's come before it. Um,
Yes. Which
I once
which which you should think of as alive, not dead.
mhm, mhm.
The
I
living
once
tradition, not the foundation.
yeah, I once heard Billy Collins say during an interview, somebody asked him, what do you do when you have writer's block? And he said, I don't know how people have writer's block. If I don't have something to say, I just find another poet's poem and write in response. So, which I thought was a smart answer. So,
That's very much often. I mean, art breeds art.
mhm.
Saxophonist Dizzy Gillespie was asked, "Where do you get your inspiration?" He said, "From Lester Young." I mean, well, it wasn't from sunsets, and that's the other thing. That word voice, that's a useful metaphor for how tone works in individual poems. But if you're trying to find your own voice, stop looking. It doesn't exist,
Ah,
right?
ah, all right. That's interesting. That's not advice you usually hear. I'm going to have to cut the end of this conversation out and
Sure.
play it in my creative writing class
All
this week.
right. That's why I used to start every orientation meeting at when I directed the MFA program. It didn't make me very popular at first, but the people, the ones who keep writing are the ones who keep writing, and they get it.
Right, right, right. All right.
You have
And
to go, but this was a deep pleasure.
yes, this was fantastic. I hope we get to talk again sometime.
Are you going to be
And
at
thank
the
you.
at the
Oh,
the
I'll
launch?
be at the book release. Yeah, very much looking
Great,
forward
great.
to it. So,
I'm going to be
all
there with my whole family. and others,
Beautiful.
and the artist who did the cover.
Oh, great. Oh, yeah, it's a beautiful cover. I know I've held it up many times, but
Yeah, she'll be there. She'll be there.
oh,
My oldest
wonderful.
friend. All right,
All right.
you got to
Well,
go. Have a
yeah,
good class or meeting or wherever you're going.
thank you. Actually, I'm going to a group on translation, so it should be fun. So,
Oh, wonderful.
yeah.
Have fun.
Thanks. Have a great day.
Bye.